Thanks for sticking around. I'm a little late today. This was supposed to take place at 11 this morning, so I appreciate y'all being here. I'm going to talk about cannabis standards, health and safety, and how to build a regulatory program. I started with this picture because cannabis brings out lots of emotions in people. Some good, some bad, but typically in a regulatory sense in a new country, it's chaos. And most people look like this when they're trying to figure stuff out. So that's what we're talking about. I am Lezli. I'm the founder of the Foundation of Cannabis Unified Standards. I'll tell you all about that later. I'm first going to tell you a little bit about my background and how I got here to help give some context to what we do. So I grew up in Arizona. My first part of my career was in mental health and public health field. From there, I worked for Eli Lilly, a company in the pharmaceutical industry for 13 years. And when I left Lilly, Arizona had legalized cannabis for medical use. And some friends wanted to apply for a license and wanted to use my expertise from the pharmaceutical industry and public health to apply for a license and get the business set up. So we applied and won the first license in Phoenix, Arizona, which is Bloom Dispensaries. Everything in Arizona is vertically integrated. So not only did we grow the plants, but we harvested them, manufactured them, put them into food, sold them in the retail, transported them to other facilities. So we were doing the entire supply chain in-house, which is typical in some US programs. My experience running a cannabis company was exactly this. It was every single day drinking out of a fire hose. We would have problem after problem. We grew very, very fast. We were really successful and fortunate that way, but we didn't have any guidance or idea on how to run a cannabis business. And it's really hard. It's different than running any other business because you run up to different challenges with the law and it touches so many different industries. So during my 3 years going through this, we had a lot of different problems. White flies, you've probably heard of before, quite common to find in cannabis. So we had one in our wholesale room, our largest room that we sold wholesale. And we had to destroy the whole room. We took everything down, cleaned out the whole room, washed everything, sanitized, brought all new plants in. And 2 days later, there's white flies on all over the baby plants. So we did the whole thing again. 2 days later, white flies again. We didn't have any standard operating procedure that explained what are all the steps to clean that room, and nobody had thought to clean the air vent up high. So we'd get the new plants in there, the air would blow from the HVAC, and here we go again. This is just one example of many that we had like this. As I started looking into trying to understand why we were having these problems, because I was talking to some of my other business owner friends that had started cannabis companies, and I started to realize that the way cannabis has been legalized in the US at the state level and not at the federal level has changed the way the regulatory structures have been developed. So when you're looking at state program regulations in the US, they're going to address who, what, when, where, and why, right? So who can grow it and sell it, what types of cannabis you can grow and sell, when and when you can't sell cannabis, where the facilities can be located, where it can be sold, and why it can be used. Is it used as a cosmetic? Is it used as a medicine? Is it used as an ag product? In any other industry, the federal agencies in the US would be responsible for creating the licensing structure, just like they're going to be here in Costa Rica. In the US, because this came up at the state level, states aren't used to writing new regulatory programs. They are used to implementing federal programs, and they get guidance from FDA and some of FDA's partners on how to help them do that. They didn't get any of that in the United States for cannabis because it's federally illegal. And so this is what they came up with. But it's missing a key component because it's not talking about how the products are made, right? How are they transported? Where are they going? And I'm going to give another example in the medical field because I think it might illustrate better what I'm trying to say. So let's take this. So you're a patient and you go into your physician and he says, you've got high cholesterol and you've done your labs and your blood work shows this. So he's going to tell you, I want you to get some more sleep, eat better, take down your stress, sleep more, take your medicine every day. And then in 30 days, you would go back to your doctor and take another lab test and see if your cholesterol went down, right? But you would never go back to the doctor in 30 days if you didn't do all of these things, expecting there to be a different result in your lab work. But in cannabis, we're not telling them to do any of these things. We're just saying, test it here and test it here. So there's no reason to assume that anything's going to change from here to here if we're not giving them any guidance on what to change to get a different and better outcome, whether that's quality, whether that's consistency and being able to make the same product over and over, whether it's safety, any of that kind of stuff. And it has a lot of downstream effects. And I think a lot of it is due to stigma. But basic tenets of quality say that you can't test quality into a product. By the time that product is being tested, the quality is either there or it's not, based on everything that's come before. This is not to say that testing isn't important. It's critical. But it is the last step. It is the validation that all of your processes and verification that all of your processes have been followed. It shouldn't be the only mechanism for making sure that end products are what they are supposed to be, because as you'll see all over the world, lots of unsafe products, lots of inconsistent products are out there. And again, this is just sort of reiterating the same thing. Dr. Deming has actually worked all over the world. He's most famous for his work in Japan with Toyota and reinventing their entire quality management system process. But basically, this system is what the US is doing and what most countries are doing. We inspect to test, but we're not closing that loop with the good manufacturing practices and the guidelines for the businesses. And as I said, lots of products, even in legal markets, doesn't mean they're safe. I'm going to give a quick story. This is an actual truffle that was purchased in a licensed facility in a state medical cannabis program in the US. It's actually my assistant who had this experience, which is why I got so much insight into it. But they came with 3 truffles, and she took a bite of one. She takes them to sleep and ate it, and she put the other 2 truffles back on her nightstand and accidentally knocked them over to the ground. One fell off, this one, and she was able to see inside and noticed all this mold. So we took the sample, the moldy truffle, to the 2 different labs, and we had them test it. And they both came up that there was all sorts of contaminants and mold and aspergillus and stuff in there. But we reported it to the state, and the state's like, we can't do anything. There's a big conflict between the federal law and the state laws on recalls. And so some states are handling them, some states are not. But the other part is we called the FDA in their regional office, and they said, I'm really sorry, Leslie, but our hands are tied. We can't oversee that. So all of these different disconnects from the high level to low level, on the ground thing are really causing problems. In this case, what the operator did, we called the operator, we let them know it was a new company that had just started making edible food products in the state. And rather than doing a proper recall and informing patients that had purchased these products, they went around, they sent their employees to each of the dispensaries in the state, and purchased back that product. So it never left the inventory control system. It shows its sales, the traceability is completely gone, and anybody that did have any downstream problems wouldn't have any recourse for that. So it's something to think about as you're starting new programs. A lot of things are not what they seem in cannabis. And what we see most often around the world, whether it's from state to state in the United States or from country to country around the globe, this is a new industry. This is a scary thing to regulate for a lot of people because there's stigma. This is something that they don't know. For the most part, regulatory officials don't know anything about when they start regulating. And so what do? what's natural. They look to another country that just recently legalized that might have similar trade structures or things like that. They look to, whoever did it last to see how they can improve it and build on it. But all those mistakes then just spread across the world. So we're building these same programs in every different country with the same mistakes. And that's part of what we do in my organization, is really try to stop that from happening. So I'm a big believer in learning from history, as you will see. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my company now and how we got started so you can understand the business model, and then I'll talk about what we do. So when I worked in the dispensary chain in Phoenix for 3 years, drinking out of the fire hose every day, it was chaos. And I left and I sold all my financial interests in that company. Nice little tidbit, I sold it way too soon because they just sold for $211 million 2 weeks ago. Anyway, I left to start this company, and I didn't really know how to do it. I just knew that any new industry needed standards, that standards are the baseline for trade. They're how things work around the world. And so I started looking at different models that had come about in new industries. And I came across the situation with the heroin epidemic in the United States. So in the 1980s, as the heroin epidemic spread across the country, laws were enacted at the local and state level, but there was no federal oversight, which is just like cannabis today. The only difference in that situation and in the situation with cannabis is that the federal government in the United States was willing to do some work to figure out a solution. So in this situation, they contracted with the Institute of Medicine to conduct a study to determine the best way to regulate these methadone clinics to assure adequate protections for health and safety and regulatory controls. That Institute of Medicine came out, and it said that they were looking for one organization that was a nonprofit organization that would serve everybody, local, state, and federal, that would provide standards, training, and third-party certification for these businesses. A few years later, this turns into a request for proposal under the Department of Health and Human Services, and Carf is the organization that answered and won that request for proposal back in '97. They are still contracted with Health and Human Services to provide these services nationwide in the US, but they also provide them globally. So the Carf business model is the business model that we have based our company on. Everything we have done since day one has been designed to build a plug-and-play solution for the federal government that allows cannabis to fit within existing regulatory structures, guidelines, standards, and doesn't have to be this sort of unicorn that's built out here and doesn't fit with the rest of industry. As I said, we're a 501c3 nonprofit. Our mission is protecting public health, consumer safety, and the environment. We develop standards. We also offer accreditation to those standards. We're just finishing up our international ISO accreditation to 17021. So we will be recognized globally as a cannabis-specific certification body. And just a reminder, because it's very unique in the space to find an organization like this, Focus has no financial stake in the cannabis industry at all. None of our employees do. We take no funding from it. We are not an advocacy organization. We don't push cannabis laws. Our position is, if you're going to build a cannabis program, you need to have adequate protections for health and safety that protect everybody. And so we are here to kind of make that happen. The first step when I started the company was we got to write some standards. So I applied to the American National Standards Institute to develop standards that were accredited, which is just the US body for ISO. We put together 300 experts from all different industry groups and built 8 committees. So we started with cultivation, extraction, infused products, retail, laboratory, security, sustainability, and packaging and labeling. We didn't just start from scratch. My intent was never to recreate the wheel. Again, the goal is to build cannabis into the existing structures and systems. And so we started with the baseline of the US Code of Federal Regulations for food, pharma, supplements, agriculture. We looked at the Food Safety Modernization Act, so all sorts of HACCP requirements and food safety stuff is in there. We looked at World Health Organization and World Trade Organization guidelines for good manufacturing, good ag collection, good lab, good distribution, production. We took all the occupational health and safety requirements from different industries in the US. And then we also looked at ISO standards for management systems, environmental, and then global cannabis regulations. And each of these committees was given what we called a foundational document, and it had all the information pertinent to that committee. And their job was to go through that information in section by section and decide what they wanted to change or add or remove. And then they would get on a call. Everybody would put their suggestions and points out. The committee would vote, and we would move on to the next thing. So they're truly consensus-based standards. There was none of the volunteers were paid, and they all had to agree on everything. Part of the requirement once you develop a new standard is putting it out for a 30-day public review to get feedback from outside stakeholders. We got some terrific feedback during that process. So the first thing that we were suggested is that extraction and infused products are typically done by the same operator, and it would be more beneficial to industry to combine those standards. And so we have manufacturing instead of those two. The second piece of advice that was really critical was that security requirements, sustainability requirements, packaging and labeling requirements, they're going to be really different for a grower versus a retailer versus a lab versus a manufacturer. And so rather than having those as standalone standards, they're put back in. And so what we offer for certification today is what's called a management system standard. So think an ISO 9001 on steroids for cannabis. It is everything from how you hire people, how you train, how you document, policies and procedures, hygiene, sanitation, waste management, supply chain management, recalls, all the things that you need to sort of run your business well. The idea being that nobody else had given the industry this guidance, and the industry needs some way to be able to meet all these regulations. I put this slide in here just because I wanted to show this is the indice of the manufacturing standard. So each standard has about 70% overlap with the key areas. Obviously, in manufacturing, there's extraction and different kind of things that are important. Cultivation has its own unique things, same with laboratory. But they're very comprehensive. So I want to switch gears again, and I'll bring this all back in the end. I want to talk about putting new regulatory programs in place and what that looks like and how it's gone around the world. So we've been very fortunate to work in 13 different countries and 29 states. And we've been able to learn from every experience. And so a lot of what we do is go around and help new countries figure out what's needed for their particular country. Cannabis, with the stigma, has so many people on the regulatory side and in the public health side worried. But it's because it touches all these different industries. But if you think about corn, I mean, corn's an ag product that's harvested in the field, right? We manufacture it and produce all sorts of things, whether it's food, whether it's oils, whether it's animal feeds, whether it's bioplastics, whether it's ethanol. And nobody gets scared of corn because that stigma is not there. Cannabis is exactly the same. It's going to go into different industries, and there's really no need to fear. Now, does it mean that it's the same? No. There are definitely more traceability and other sort of controls needed because of the psychotropic nature and the medicinal nature. But those are things we already do in other industries. So it's not rocket science to figure out. We've just got to work with the existing structure within that country. And this is where most countries and states get lost. They think about this as, I'm going to start a cannabis agency that's going to only do this. But if your cannabis agency, and I mean, you guys have how many ministries here? I was looking on your government webpage yesterday, and between tourism and agriculture and all these different things, all those people need to be involved in the structure building of this program. And if you're not considering all the different uses, you're going to build a program that's going to exclude some very critical point. And think if we couldn't use corn as fuel. Think if we couldn't use corn as food, right? So we don't want to do that with cannabis. We really want to think through all the uses and make sure that the program that we develop has pathways for all of those products to be built. Which means it's time to see the bigger picture. So this is basically what we do and how we do it. So if you think about a cannabis program, just like all the different agencies, it's like the human body. All these systems have to work together. And if they're not talking to one another, it's a problem. We've seen it in California. They decided to have 9 different agencies oversee their adult use program. No communication plan was built from the get-go. It takes 9 agencies to get a cannabis product to market in California. The cost, the time, the hassles, and the paperwork for that are just, I mean, they're killing the industry. It's why California is struggling so bad. But it's also killing the regulatory agencies because they don't have any solid plan to talk to one another. So it's really important that these agencies that are involved have some sort of plan up front on how they're going to talk, when they're going to talk, and what they're going to talk about. This is kind of, and it's important because you can think of each industry that it hits, that cannabis touches, but it's still more than that. Cannabis is very much a culture, right? There's the legacy operators. There is, the folks that have been doing this for thousands of years in Morocco growing hash. There are people that have been, farming hemp all over in cannabis. So we have to take into account not just the regulatory structure. We have to look at the culture of that country. We have to look at the history of that country with cannabis and other drugs. We need to look at the tax infrastructure. We need to look at their belief systems. Is there a religious component that makes this completely prohibited for a lot of people, that it's going to be, not so accepted? We need to look at their healthcare system. Where is cannabis going to support that, and how is it going to be integrated into your existing healthcare structures? We need to look at the illicit market. How much activity is coming through Costa Rica today? If we don't have a good baseline, how are we going to know if this is improving or not, right? And you'll see, most countries legalize this for economic development purposes, right? Makes perfect sense. It's bringing in billions all over the place. But if you ask an economist, why would you regulate an unregulated industry? Any economist will say the goal is to control that industry. The secondary outcome and benefit is the tax structure. But if you're building an industry based on tax revenues, you're missing the whole point of controlling the regulated industry. That's what's happening in California. There's a bigger illicit market than there is legal market now. It's too hard, too much of a challenge for operators, and they've made it so hard to get through the system that people are just selling it out their back door. They'll have a front end that's a dispensary and they'll sell it out the back. You need to look at infrastructure, right? What kind of water resources are here? What kind of transportation resources are here? What's the climate like? How much sunlight do they have every day? What's going to happen indoors versus outdoors? What's the insurance industry like here? How is it going to be for these companies to insure their transport and their businesses? What other natural resources does Costa Rica have, or any country have, that would really fit into this? I know just from personal experience, you guys have an amazing recycling system here, like as a country, and it's just top of the line. That should be considered in this program. How do we get the cannabis product waste, not the flower and materials, but the packaging? How do we keep moving towards what Costa Rica as a country already values and include cannabis in that? Topography, obviously. Trade agreements are really big. What kind of trade agreements, bilateral, international trade agreements are in place? We can't not think of those, because eventually this is going around the world and they're going to have to go through those same trade systems. So there's a lot. And the idea is that if you consider it up front, you're not going to have the problems downstream. This is, I'm not going to get too detailed. I'm happy to explain this later to anyone that wants to know, but this is something we put together for FDA because they can't seem to figure out what are the different pathways, what products are going to fall under those pathways, who's going to regulate it. So for us in the US, we've got medical programs and adult use programs. In 37 states is medical, and I think 12 now for adult use. Those programs aren't going to go away just because the federal government decides to regulate this at the federal level. That ship has sailed, right? So how do we find a structure for cannabis that will allow that existing industry that's been built over the last decade to merge with the other existing industries? Because what you consider medicine in a medical program in the US is only medicine by the state's definition. It doesn't meet any of the requirements for medicine that FDA has, which is why they're having such a hard time rectifying this, right? We don't have the controls, we don't have the data, we don't have the research to understand these as a pharmaceutical. When we have that, it'll be very easy for them to regulate that way. And if you think about it, that's the reason like Marinol and Epidiolex and Sativex have been approved. They went the pharma pathway. They didn't go a cannabis pathway. And so they got FDA approval. But the state programs, most of them don't want to or need to go that route. They exist to help the folks in that community. But if we take away the word medicine and we replace it with therapeutic, it becomes a lot more accurate when you think about what we're talking about, because it doesn't matter if it's adult use. If somebody's using it after work to relax, like they would a glass of wine or beer, that's wellness, that's therapeutic, right? If they're using it for sleep. So if we can separate out and leave the state programs and not mix them in with the medicine, it will simplify things at the federal level a lot. And then there's the whole food and beverage thing, right? So where are we going to go with the consumer packaged goods? We need to know how to put this in every type of food and supplements, in beverages. And we need to know how to use it as an ingredient, an incipient. So those are things that would still stay under the FDA type pathway in the US, maybe stay under the Ministry of Health here, but they would want to talk to these other agencies that are involved too to make sure that nothing's conflicting between it. And then the last one is just the industrial, and that's pretty straightforward, you know, fiber, fuel, that kind of stuff. So, but again, this is just a US example. When we come into a state or a country and we talk to them, we will do like a full assessment of their business and make sure that they're not repeating the same mistakes that other countries have made. It is pre-planning, kind of preventative measure that can save just, oh my gosh, unbelievable headaches. So we work on both sides. On the industry side, we do everything to help a business run better. So from licensing and applications to developing training for your employees, to writing your standard operating procedures, reviewing documents, to conducting risk management assessments for insurance. Any of that on the industry side we can help with. And then on the public sector side, we do a lot of different things, and it really varies depending on where we're working that particular time. So sometimes before a law is passed, we'll come in and do legislative briefings. Oftentimes we'll do a market analysis before we ever go in there and do a legislative briefing. We just conducted a regulatory review for one of the states in the US because they've had all sorts of complaints and problems with their products recently, and we wanted to kind of take a look at what is the regulatory structure like? Where are these problems coming from? Why are these products in this market? And we found, 8 different definitions for cannabis within the same regs. Well, then every downstream definition is incorrect as well, right? So there's just some basic elements of this that you have to kind of think through up front. And then sort of anything else. We do have a hotline so we can handle complaints for companies or agencies. We do training, we do auditor training, consultant training, risk management training, and then resource development. A lot of times we can come in and build the information that the industry needs to see from the regulatory agency and help them get the messaging through that they're trying to get through. A lot of times that's a challenge to, it's not a language barrier like speaking Spanish to English. It's just a language barrier like English to English, and nobody understands what you're saying. So that's about it. We're excited to be here in Costa Rica, and for those of you that don't know, they've been doing some amazing research with hemp and cannabis here, and they're going to talk about that tomorrow morning, which is why I am here, because all of that research starts as the foundation for any kind of program and market analysis. We have to know what's going to happen here, because it's not going to be the same as anywhere else. So again, I'm Lezli. My email's up there, our website's up there. Love to hear from you. We are a nonprofit, so we do all sorts of education and happy to answer questions for anybody as needed. Website's got contact forms all over it, but feel free to email me too. And good luck. It's exciting.